Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning, friends. I think we are going to take up another important issue which relates to the understanding of the rural society and peasants. Basically, here we are dealing with the unit 2, which is based on the village studies in India. I think when we try to speak about the village studies, it is going to be an important pillar with regard to the understanding of Indian society, and sometimes it is been said that if we have to understand Indian society, we have to understand it through the villages. So, that way the village studies as a theme for understanding of rural society becomes very important. Bernard S. Cohen has spoken about the three major traditions of approach towards the understanding of Indian society at the end of the 18th century, and he basically says that there are three basic possibilities through which we can study the Indian society. We can speak about the understanding in terms of Orientalist, we can have the understanding through the missionary, and the third is through the administrative. So, I think these are the three ways in which we can understand the Indian society. When we try to approach the Indian society, we have these three mediums which will help us in understanding the Indian society. Now, when we try to speak about these issues, the important thing is that when we try to speak about how the Orientalists have viewed the Indian society, and we try to say that Orientalists have basically focused upon the textual view of the society, and they were basically trying to speak about the village in terms of static, timeless and spaceless. On the other hand, when we try to speak about the concern for the understanding of the missionaries, missionaries were basically concerned towards understanding the problems which are associated with the village communities, especially the issues related to untouchability, or we try to speak about the issues of discriminations which were prevalent in the Indian society. So, that way we try to see that there are different ways in which we can approach the Indian society. Now, let us say we try to see that the missionary and the Orientalist were the polar opposite in terms of the assessment of Indian culture and society. However, both of them have agreed that there is a religious ideas and the practices that underlay all the social structures with regard to the Indian society. The third which we try to spoke about is the concern for the administrative. By administrative, we mean to say that the concern which has been generated by the administrators, especially when they try to focus upon the various aspects related to the Indian society, either it is the question of the customary laws, or if it is a question of the land revenue system, or if you try to see that they were trying to speak about the concern for the land reforms. So, we try to see that the administrators, they were trying to understand the caste system, they wanted to study the land revenue system, or they wanted to study the various components related to the Indian society and culture, and for that purpose, in order to document those things officially, they wanted to have the study of the Indian society, especially the villages. So, we try to see that all these things, either it is the question of Orientalist, the missionary, or we try to speak about the administrative, all of them were basically concerned with the understanding of the Indian society. Like when we try to speak about the concern of administrators, especially we try to speak about that there are certain important concerns related to the provincial and the imperial gazetters of India and the census of India, which provided a systematic account of Indian society in the second half of the last century. And the reports of the revenue settlement also were very important in dealing with the relations of the peoples with the land, with the place, or with the specific region. So, that way the British administrators, who turned out to be an ethnographers, have an official view before collecting the relevant information about the village studies. So, Cohen basically tries to say that there are the features of the study of Indian society can be seen in terms of a broader scale, that is called as humanistically oriented traditions, which emphasize the relationship between the textual studies and the static model of contemporary Indian society. An administrative tradition centers on the census for the study of caste, which sought to see the Indian society as a collection of discrete entities whose traditions and customs should be classified and studied. And then we have the traditions of economic study, which sought to describe the working of village economies with some attention to the social structure of the villages. And also we have the anthropological traditions, which basically try to study the tribal people, especially in the light of the so called indigenous development. So, ultimately we try to see that the study of Indian villages, which began in the 18th century with the intensive survey work which has been carried out with regard to the land holding patterns, and the early systematic studies particularly by the important people like Munro, Metcalfe or Maine or Baden-Powell. I will just reflect it out. So, we have people like Munro, Metcalfe, Baden-Powell and other administrators who were basically trying to study the understanding of the Indian society in terms of the administrative viewpoint. Baden-Powell had tried to see the Indian villages in terms of the closed and isolated systems. This view, however, created a lot of resentment among the several anthropologists and sociologists. The studies of Indian villages in the 50s were therefore based on the assumptions that the Indian villages were not static, isolated and homogeneous. It was changing, it has its connection with the outside world and it was highly differentiated. So, I think they were just trying to see the contrast which has been documented by the so called administrators. Likewise, the official view of the caste system, with regard to the official view of the Indian villages, one can say that villages were basically being seen as the village republics in terms of self sufficient and the corporate villages. And here it is important to quote the understanding of Louis Dumont to the three meanings of the term village community. First is that it is seen as a political society, second is as a body of co-owners of the soil, and the third is the emblem of the traditional economy and polity. And ultimately, it is to be seen in terms of a watchword of the Indian patriotism. Thus, Louis Dumont in that sense has a specific way of looking to the Indian society in terms of political society, in terms of body of co-owners of the soil and also in terms of the emblem of the traditional economy. A village is far from a specific locale and more than just a collection of houses, lanes and the fields. Mandelbaum points out that for a village it is prime social reality and for the observer it is a principal unit for understanding of the Indian society. So, that way the notion that Indian villages is monolithic, atomistic and static is unacceptable to the students of village life in India. The Indian villages has hardly been a republic and a self sufficient unit. The village exogamy itself broke its isolation, atomism and independence. Its dependency on the wider economic and the political institutions and the instrumentality has been well brought in the recent studies. And we try to see that villages which has been seen as an understanding of a specific unit is to be seen in terms of the republic, self sufficient units or autonomous is going to be distorted. And villages even today exist as a territorial cohesive unit and the village identity, solidarity and the loyalty cut across the caste and the communities. Now, let us try to see that how the different people they try to see the village studies. Here we are basically referring to the various sociologists and the social anthropologists who tries to understand the Indian society in a specific framework. And we try to see that it was in the year 1955 that we try to see that there are watershed in the studies of village communities, especially the work by S. U. Dubey on Indian village, M. N. Srinivas on India's villages, D. N. Majumdar on the rural profile and Makim Marriott as the village studies. They were all published in 1955, and we try to see that the village studies contains to be the central theme of the sociological research in the 60s and the 70s as well. But the emphasis has shifted from the single village holistic studies to the multi-village comparative studies, and diachrony was emphasized with regard to the synchrony. Thus, the historical materials were used along with the intensive field data for analyzing the changing rural society. The folk urban continuum and the little community were the framework which has been used by Redfield and which has been examined by B.R. Chauhan and D.N. Majumdar and several other scholars in the field of rural studies. Especially when we try to speak about the contribution of B.R. Chauhan in the rural studies in terms of trend reports, we try to say that he has drawn the 4 lines of approach in the study of the caste in relation to the village communities. They are one village and one caste, one village and many caste, one caste and many villages, and many caste and many villages. The village studies are in a single village studies, studies in 2 villages, and the villages which are done in the multi-village studies. Chauhan thus provides an exhaustive review of the village studies, but he does not raise a question about their theoretical and the methodological orientation towards the village studies. It was basically M. N. Srinivas, S. C. Dubey, Yogesh Atal and Ramakrishna Mukherjee who raises a few important questions about the village studies and their significance. Srinivas observes that the bias in favor of literary material is more clearly seen in the syllabi of Indological studies of our universities. Indology has come to be regarded as a knowledge about the Indian past, but Srinivas puts his position as follows, that the only cure for the literary bias lies in doing the field research. So, he technically wanted that Indology has to be replaced by the field studies. Srinivas states in the same essay that the point I am trying to make is the observation of Hindu social life has been and is still to be seen in terms of not as a book view or the upper caste view, we have to see it differently, and Dumont has been criticized for making or taking the position of the book view of the caste system, which has been violated by M. N. Srinivas by moving from book view to the field view. Srinivas has said to have taken the upper caste view of the village communities, and the criticism of his concept of Sanskritization and dominant caste has been raised by people like Edmund Leach, C. Parvathama and many other with regard to the upper caste view. The method of intensive field study has been promoted by Srinivas not only through his study of Rampura, but a couple of students and the colleagues of Srinivas, namely A. M. Shah, Andre Bete and Anand Chakravarti. They try to see the intensive field study and they try to come out with some new understanding about the villages, like Andre Bete has tried to see the issue of caste, class and power in terms of the Weberian model. Similarly, Anand Chakravarti has tried to see the Marxian viewpoint with regard to the understanding of the village structure. So, the Srinivas layout has basically emphasized that there should be a strong plea for the participant observation rather than the survey method and the statistical exercises. There are a couple of points which we should like to make about Srinivas' view on social sciences. The object of the study and the nature of inquiry would normally determine the method of study. The actual relationships between the higher and the lower caste, the landowners, tenants and the agriculturals and the judgments and the communes can be better understood by the method of the intensive field work. If a method of intensive field study is applied to all the village studies irrespective of the specific nature of data required, it would amount to a methodological appropriatism. So, Srinivas was basically concerned towards bringing about certain amount of reform with regard to the methodological issues to be involved with regard to the village studies. A number of plus points of the fieldwork are noted by Srinivas. It refers to the different set of approach, a method and a technique compared with the macro survey. Srinivas ignores the studies conducted by T. S. Epstein, F. G. Bailey, which also had tried to see the fieldwork in a different framework, especially using the historical and the statistical material and have the comparative focus which has not been done by M. N. Srinivas. Dasgupta has undertaken an analysis of 126 village studies with the 2 specific objectives. First is to develop a simplified typology of village socio-economic system based on the small set of keys variables, and second is to examine how far this typology helps to provide a dynamic theory of village social institutions under a given socio-political setup. So, virtually we try to see that the studies which has been done by Das Gupta, they try to focus upon the multivariate approach, interdisciplinary approach, extensive coverage of data, and also the standard method of data collection was based on the common research design. So, virtually we try to see that these understanding has been carried forward further by another scholar, that is Professor S. C. Dubey. S. C. Dubey was speaking about the structural functional approach for studying the Indian villages, and he referred to the criticism of the intensive field studies because he says that they do not provide the diagnostic or the illustrative case studies for understanding the structure and processes. Villages are to be viewed as biotic community and not as a synthesized community. And the third is, these studies lack a coherent frame of references relevant to the structure and organization of the Indian society. So, Dubey has tried to focus upon the understanding of the villages from the structural functional viewpoint, and Dubey suggests that it has to be seen contextual, classical, and the local traditions are to be used. It has to be seen with regard to the western and the emergent national traditions, which are to be seen as a useful tools for the study of Indian village community. Dubey has focused upon the structural functional approach, and his ideas remain intact, and he writes that a good study of change invariably follow through the good structural functional themal study of the society. Yogesh et al. Touches upon the viability of Indian villages as a unit of study, and later on A. R. Desai rightly observes that Ramakrishna Mukherjee's approach to the study of rural society is qualitatively different from that of Srinivas, Dubey and et al., because Ramakrishna Mukherjee analyzes the colonial forces and the factors which led to the study of villages. Mukherjee has preferred a combined or the synthesized approach where he tries to study the dynamics of rural society, that is his work also, and he tried to see that how the class relations and the hierarchy are to be seen vis-a-vis the caste system, and methodologically too he tries to combine the historical as well as the empirical data. So, the village studies which has been done in the 50s, basically they try to focus upon various component of the methodological issues, but later on we try to see that these contributions has been significantly taken up by Louis Dumont and D. F. Pocock, and who wrote a long review article in the first issue of the important journal, that is Contribution to Indian Sociology, and they try to focus upon the methodological issues involved with regard to the understanding of the villages in India. We try to see that Mandelbaum, who provides a comparison of 8 villages in his paper in the edited volume by Robert Redfield and Milton Singer with regard to the village India, and we try to see that the village India try to cover up many important aspects which has been taken up later on by M. N. Srinivas in the form of India's villages, and here I think many scholars have significantly contributed towards the understanding of the villages. We try to see that the volume has theoretically as well as methodological issues on the study of Indian villages, which has been undertaken by M. N. Srinivas, and the two important questions which has been raised by Kathleen Gogg were: to what extent is Kumbhapetai an isolable social unit, and to what extent it is correct changing in this respect. Gogg analyzes the economic organization, local administration, ritual practices at the village level, intercaste relations within the village, and some general relations of the village to the wider community. Srinivas states that he spent 12 months during the fieldwork in Rampura, and these 12 months has a specific purpose in terms of the in-depth field analysis. The account given by Srinivas gives an impression that Rampura was seen as an isolate whole. He analyzes several aspects of social organization of village, including the religion, rituals, hierarchy, although he refers to the competition within the village, but that was very meager, and the village solidarity, interdependence among the caste were basically seen as an important component with regard to the patron-client relations, the rule of dominant caste and the counterbalance of the village unity and the caste unity are some of the important aspects which has been studied by M. N. Srinivas. We try to see that Kathleen Gog has tried to focus upon basically when the Tanjore village was being studied in the changing system. She was trying to emphasize upon that how we try to see that the changing system are to be seen with regard to the open changing system which are relative in nature and also which are to be governed by the secular laws. And we try to see that Kathleen Gog has adopted a class view of the Indian village, whereas Srinivas has used the cultural view of the village, and Kathleen Gog's approach was seen as diachronic. However, the M. N. Srinivas approach was seen as synchronic with regard to the village studies. Cohen looks at the caste relations in the villages from the viewpoint of the depressed caste, especially the Chamars. It is not a class view of the caste as seen in the case of Gog, but certainly Cohen's analysis is diachronic in nature, and he also analyzes the factor external to the villages which brought changes in the intercaste relation. We try to see that people like Kathleen Gog, B. S. Cohen and the Beale, A.R.N. Beals, they have conducted intensive studies on the respective villages for about the period of 12 months for having a wider understanding about the villages. We try to see that Oscar Lewis has used the comparative analysis of peasant culture in India and Mexico. So, it was not only the comparison within India, rather it was seen as a comparison which was across the nations, across the civilizations. Oscar Lewis gives a fairly detailed account of the similarities and the contrasts between the two villages. One was the village of Tepoztlan and another was the Ranikhera, which was basically seen as the two entities which he tries to compare, and we basically try to see that what are the important questions which are to be raised with regard to the village as a community which has been taken up by Oscar Lewis. First is that is the village a community, that is the first concern. Second is to what extent do the physical limits of the village defines the limits for these dimensions, and the third is to what extent do these aspects of communities spill over into other villages, so that the community might better be defined in terms of the units larger than the single village. And lastly, what is the quality of social relations of the mutual interdependence of persons or the social groups within each village. Oscar Lewis in fact has seen that the Indian village are to be seen from the point of view of the Mexican village. Some of the important conclusion that he tries to make out is he quotes from his study of the Mexican village and argues that it applies to the Indian village as well. So, it was basically a comparative analysis of the Mexican village and the Indian village, and he fails to recognize the historicity of the Indian village and the economy, social organization and the polity, while adopting the anthropology of Tepoztlan to Ranikhera. So, I think that was the limitation which has been taken up and which was been ignored by the understanding of Oscar Lewis towards the village studies. So, virtually we try to see that we had many different experiments which are being done at the various levels in order to understand the village in a specific framework, and especially when we try to speak about the contribution of Makim Marriott, he discusses the small world of the villages within the universe of Indian civilization. He also asks the two important questions: can such a village be satisfactorily comprehended and conceived as a whole in itself? Second is, can understanding of one such village contribute to the understanding of the greater culture of the society? So, I think these are the two very relevant questions that studying a single village, is it going to be a sort of generalization for all the villages of India, and can it be a representative villages in the real sense? But somehow he tried to carry out these aspects of social structure and religious culture by his studies on the village of Kishangadi, which he has undertaken with regard to the understanding of the Indian culture and civilization. We try to see that the structural analysis of the village community in India has been seen by various scholars, like I just said that S. C. Dubey has used the structural functional approach, and that work was been published in 1955 in the name of Indian village. and later on he also tried to speak about the changes in Indian villages, which was another important work. The Changing Indian Villages was another work which has been done by S. U. Dubey. He recognizes the semi-autonomous character of Indian village, yet he did not want them to be static, timeless or changeless. And we try to see that Dubey's study of Shamirpet provides a description of the socio-economic and the ritual structures, family ties, level of livings and the living together. All these components are being taken up by S. C. Dubey in the study of Shamirpet village. And then we have D. N. Majumdar, whose studies was on caste and communication in an Indian village. And also we have the work by Oscar Lewis, who studies the village life in the northern India. And both of them have emphasized upon the notion of desensitization, horizontal mobility and the role of caste and clan in the factionalism and other changes in the rural India. However, we have the studies by F. G. Bele, T. S. Epstein, Andre Bete, Kathleen Gog, Ishwaran Mukherjee, Rao and Sharma, who had emphasized on the specific aspect of village communities such as the social change, economic development, social stratification, class relations, economy, and also we try to see that how caste, class and urbanization they try to overlap with regard to the changes in with regard to the Indian society. On the line of M. N. Srinivas, Marriott and Majumdar, Macky Marriott and D. N. Majumdar also had another edited volume on change and continuity in India's villages, which has been brought about by K. Ishwaran at the beginning of the 1970s. And the village studies in these volumes are from the various states including Himachal Pradesh, Karnataka, Uttar Pradesh, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. We try to see that Ishwaran observes that the change in the village society are national oriented and global oriented. So, he was trying to see that the villages are going to have its influence from the regional, state character and the national character, and also it has a change which is coming from the global level. So, virtually he was trying to speak about the changes which are to be seen with regard to the Indian society. And Ishwaran writes that these village studies have generally established the need for two approaches. First, the need for analyzing the social change in terms of multiple factors rather than in terms of a single factor, and second is the need to correlate micro anthropological studies with the macro sociological analysis. Virtually we try to see that the understanding of the micro and the macro sociological analysis is very significant when we try to see it in terms of the real interpretation of the village studies in India. And Ishwaran says that these are the important questions which one has to really pose and which has been posed in his contribution to the volume edited by him. First is, what is the nature of social change? That is the first important thing. Second is, what areas of villages are undergoing changes? That is another important component. Third is, what is the content and the goal of such changes? And then fourth is, what are the channels of social change? And fifth is, what are the intrinsic and the extrinsic sources of social change? And finally, what are the prospect for the future changes? I think these are the very significant questions which has been raised by Ishwaran in his study, which is an edited volume and which tries to cut across the various states as I discussed earlier, and that is how we try to see that the changes are to be seen across the culture, across the state, and that has to be put in terms of a generalization. We have also significant works with regard to the village studies, which was basically seen as a shift. One of course is The Pills Against Poverty by Goran Djurfeld, Goran Djurfeld, Goran Djurfeld and Stefan Lindberg. I think this work was again a remarkably different work, because it tries to speak about the problem specific studies of the village in Tamil Nadu. And here the author has also published another important piece, that is Behind Poverty, the social formation in the Tamil village. Now, the studies reveals that it is wrong to treat the health situation as a natural product. It is rather a historical and the social phenomenon. So, the strategy of the field study was to be followed in terms of an extensive census covering the demographic and the economic subject, an ethnographic data collection through the unstructured interviews, specific interviews, case studies and the small sample studies and the participant observation method. A conventional sociological sample of around 200 village households was being conducted by them in order to have the picture about the villages. Then also we had another significant work by Biplab Dasgupta. Dasgupta had classified the village studies into two important things. First is the fact finding empirical studies and second is the problem oriented studies. So, I think these are certain important works which are being done by various scholars in with regard to the studies on villages in India. The studies of the village community in 60s and subsequently have indicated a shift in the theoretical as well as the methodological issue, and we try to see that the issue specific study has replaced the earlier holistic studies. So, we have now the small studies of single village. Within the single village also a specific phenomenon was to be observed. So, there was a gradual shift which has taken place with regard to the understanding of the villages. It was a cross cultural studies also, it was multiple village studies. So, I think different patterns have been adopted by the villages in India by these scholars, and the structural analysis has been found more relevant, especially many scholars have done the structural functional approach for understanding the Indian villages, and we try to see that methodologically field studies combined with the survey research, historical data and interdisciplinary inputs have been conducted, and that has been seen as an important issue with regard to the understanding of the Indian villages. So, friends, I think when we try to speak about these particular issues, we try to find out that various studies which have been done with regard to the Indian villages, they had been seen as something which is going to be methodologically correct, or sometimes they try to pose upon certain issues which are going to be seriously seen, because villages in India are quite heterogeneous, and the studies which has been done by various scholars, these studies were basically trying to understand the villages in a specific framework with regard to a specific methodology, or sometimes they were trying to study the specific phenomenon. So, virtually we try to see that these studies which have been done by various scholars starting from M.N. Srinivas, S.C. Dubey, Makim Marriott, D.N. Majumdar, or for that sake we try to speak about the transformation which took place, Oscar Lewis, and then we try to see the new studies which has been done by Lindbergh, and we have the studies by Biplab Dasgupta and others. So, there is a whole transition which took place. We try to see that there was a watershed of the village studies which have been done in 1950s. Many scholars have contributed, and there was a valid reason for that, because the Indian government was very particular about understanding the Indian villages, because the various rural development programs have been inaugurated during that period of time, and we try to see that these village studies has provided a great impetus towards the various developmental issues. And I think the important thing is that how there was a shift which took place. We started with the Indologist, basically the Orientalist, who tried to have the book view of the Indian villages, and then gradually we shifted towards the so called missionaries and the administrators who try to have the census data, or they try to have the various provincial data with regard to the Indian villages. And then I think we had started moving towards the field view which has been emphasized by M.N. Srinivas. So, virtually a great shift which took place is between the book view and to the field view, that is considered to be an important aspect which one has to see. And I think Louis Dimo and D.F. Pocock, they try to have the classification of various studies which has been done earlier, and they try to document it into a famous journal, that is Contribution to Indian Sociology. The whole volume was dedicated towards the studies of villages in India. We try to see the contribution of B.R. Chauhan, who try to study that how a village and a caste can be related to each other with regard to bringing about a change, single caste, single village. single caste many villages, many caste single village, and many caste many villages. So, I think many permutations and combinations can be possible in order to explore the Indian villages, but the important thing is that what aspect is going to be studied, that makes the things more important. And we basically try to see that in the later phase, we try to see that earlier we have the structural functional approach, where caste was seen as an important indicator and variable for the study or analysis, but gradually we try to see that this has later on shifted to some other components, especially we try to see, let us say in the last study which we try to see the work which has been highlighted by people like Viplab Das Gupta, and also we have the contribution which has been made by Dudgerfield and Lindbergh, who try to study the village mainly in terms of the issue of health. So, I think the caste itself was not seen as a prime variable under whose concern we have to see the village alone, rather we try to see some other dimensions have been added, like Kathleen Gog had tried to study the class view, class dimension of the villages. In that sense, we try to see Andre Bete's contribution, which was been seen as caste, class and power in the Weberian framework in terms of the understanding of the stratification. And also we try to see certain other studies like Viplab Das Gupta had tried to focus upon the problem oriented issues with regard to the development. So, I think these are certain things which we have to keep in mind, and we have to see that what areas of the villages are going to be changing in that sense, what are the content and the goals of such changes, what are the nature of social changes which are being brought about in the villages, and what are the channels of the social change. And if we can document these things, if we can grasp these things, are we in a position to actually pin it down, or can we try to see that we can have the holistic model through which we can understand the changes which can take place in the other villages or in the coming villages. So, I think this is going to be an important issue that we have to focus upon. But the important thing is that the villages which we try to see, these villages, how they have to be seen as a compact entity, because now when we try to speak about the villages, especially in terms of theoretical and the methodological issues, we try to find out that now the villages are becoming the global village. So, now we try to see in the era of globalization, we try to speak about the globalization, and where we have the global villages, the villages which are being connected through internet or through the ICT with the wider world. The small story of the village which is basically seen as a local incidence becomes global. We try to see the atrocities against Dalits, or maybe the atrocities against the women's, how they are going to be surfaced at the national and the international level. So, virtually we try to see that the villages which were being seen as an isolated whole, which were being considered to be having a limited domain in terms of interaction or in terms of their reflection to the wider society. But now we try to see that the small instances or incidents which takes place in the rural India, they are becoming global. And it is not only that, even we try to see that with the advent of privatization, we try to see that there is a certain amount of encroachment by the private sectors into the rural India. We try to see that many changes are taking place in the villages. Now, we try to speak about the contract farming, we try to speak about the misuse of the fertilizers, or maybe the side effects of the fertilizers and the pesticides are been coming up, and people are now going for organic farming. So, new forms of changes are visible in Indian villages, and the villages are basically seen as the site of contestation, because now the villages are not simply the innocent or the ignorant units, rather they are to be seen as an important guiding pillar for establishing the new India, which has to be seen more in terms of how the future India has to be seen. Like when we try to speak about the issue of privatization, the corporate farming, we have to see that whether the villages are seen as the silent players, or simply they are going to accept the external forces which are coming through the private sectors, or sometimes they are going to resist it. Basically, we try to see that in many parts of India, we have many instances where there are the severe peasant protest and the peasant movements which took place, especially when the development or the forceful eviction of the land takes place in the rural society. Then I think many instances of the revolts have started by the peasantry, by the farmers, and they try to come forward in terms of the specific movements. I think these things which we will discuss in the later phases, especially in terms of the farmers movement, or we try to see various other movements which are taking place, maybe because of the ecology, or maybe because of the use of excessive chemical fertilizers, or sometimes we try to see that the new initiatives which are coming up in the form of the so called shortage of food, or sometimes we have the issue of food sovereignty. So, I think many issues are going to come up which will try to focus upon how the village has to be seen very differently. So, now the villages which are simply to be seen as the players which are to be seen in terms of caste and class only, but now we try to see the new dynamics which are coming up, because now the power is from within as well as from the outside, and we have to see that how the villages are to be seen in terms of these changes, and we basically try to see that these changes are to be seen more in terms of how it is going to be acceptable at the wider society. Like when we try to speak about a change in terms of a model village, now this model village, can it be replica in other parts of the Indian society? I think it is a serious question, because experiment at one village may not be having the same bearing in the other villages or in the other regions of the country. So, we have to see that how the villages are to be seen, because we try to see that village are not seen simply as the assemblage of the households and multiple lanes or the, the rural countryside. Rather, we try to see that it has the agency, it has the players, it has the villagers which are seen as the active participant, not as a passive listeners or as a passive observers. They are also trying to dictate, they are also trying to hegemonize, they also try to come forward for their own cause. So, I think we have to see that to what extent the villages are to be seen as the entity which are one can say not the silent entities, rather they are having certain amount of revolutionary character, they are sometimes having certain amount of new transformations which can take place, because many times we try to see that villages in India which are simply seen as the silent entities, but now if we try to visit some of the villages, we try to see that they are as modern as the urban, like they have the satellite televisions, they have well connected roads, they have the modern transport communication. The only thing which they miss, of course, is the proper infrastructure or the urban based infrastructure in the real sense, and also the population. But apart from that, there are many villages which are seen as at par with the urban cities, and that way we try to see that the contrast which has been there between the village and the urban, between the rural and the urban, that is also going to bridge up, and we try to see that gradually we are seeing that urban is reaching to the rural in many forms, either it is in terms of the health practices, or it is to be seen in terms of the use of the land, especially for cultivation, or sometimes we try to see it is used as a site for investment, or sometimes we try to see that it is used as a site for health practices, or sometimes we try to see that it is seen as the voluntary initiatives by various NGOs or the civil societies to bring about the transformation in the rural society. So, I think multiple forces are there, multiple players are there who are working for the understanding of the villages in India. So, virtually friends, we try to see that the villages which we try to speak about, I think the various village studies which we try to quote, the various scholars which we have mentioned, these scholars and these villages sometimes they are the documented and sociologically relevant studies which are quite fruitful for understanding or diagnosis of the villages in India. But beyond that, what is more important is that villages are to be seen more in terms of not only as a vibrant unit, but also we try to see the villages which can act as the site for the new revolutions. Especially I think we had many instances which has taken place, especially the areas which are near to the urban centers and they are basically near to the metropolis. They have shown the drastic transformation with regard to the challenges which they have thrown upon to the state, to the government in that sense, like the farmers protest which is going on in general. I think with regard to the market price, with regard to the fluctuations in the subsidies, or with regard to the electricity bills and the other things, these things are going to be very significant and relevant, which one has to see. But what is more important is that we have also to see that to what extent we are in a position to see these villages in terms of the true entity. And I think the important thing that comes out is that villages which are undergoing the changes by themselves, basically which we try to see in terms of the changes which are coming up because of the intrinsic forces, but also we try to see that the changes are also coming from the external agencies, from the exogenous factors, and village has to succumb to these challenges and the pressure in the coming era. And I think we try to see that now the villages which are basically seen as the sites for new sort of engagement, especially we try to see the technology which is reaching to the villages in a very different way. We have the smartphones, we have the ICT enabled learning, we have the what you can say, the new forms of interaction which are taking place. Many initiatives have been done by MS Swaminathan Foundation. MS Swaminathan Foundation is basically working for bridging the gap between the rural and the urban, especially with the ICT initiatives. And we try to see that these ICT initiatives are basically seen as the real transformations, because they are trying to link up through the digital wires in that sense as such, and these digital wires are trying to bridge the gap between the rural and the urban. But I think friends, the important concern that we have to keep in mind, of course, is that to what extent these changes are going to be drastically different. Like when we try to speak about the changes which are being brought about by ICT enabled what you can say, intrusions, we also try to see that the new forms of unequals are created. Now we try to see that there is a digital divide which is coming up between the rural and the urban. Even within the rural also we try to see that one rural in a specific region is very different from the rural in another region. So I think sometimes these sort of adverse inclusions or adverse developments are basically leading to new forms of adversity in terms of the new forms of inequalities, and that is how we have to see that the new villages are to be seen in terms of not as the homogeneous entities, rather they are to be seen in terms of the entities which are heterogeneous, which have the different implications. And I think many scholars and many contributions which we try to see are quite important, especially when we try to speak about the various village studies which has been done. We try to see significant works have been done with regard to the village studies in India. Of recent, basically we try to speak about Dipankar Gupta's important work, that is withering away of the villages, that whether the villages are going to disappear, that is the new form of changes which we sometimes try to see, that the villages are going to wither off. Or sometimes we try to see the contribution which has been made by Surinder Jotka, who is trying to study the villages in terms of the new framework, the new caste equations, and also we try to see that how the village sites are basically seen as changing in terms of the agrarian economy, or sometimes it is seen as being bit modernized in terms of agrarian economy, and how the villages are changing its character. And apart from that, we also try to see many village studies which has been seen in terms of having its linkage with the diaspora, especially we try to see that the rural India which is having its connect with the not only the Indian nation, but also with the world across. and especially we try to see the new form of diaspora which are coming up. Many studies which has been done by Vivek Kumar, and we also see by Ronki Ram, they have trying to see, and even by Paramjit Singh Judge, who try to see that how the Indian diaspora, especially of the rural units, are being seen abroad, and there are the linkage which are been there between the various Dalits groups. We also try to see that new practices which are being initiated in the rural India through the self-help group, that also is coming up in a very drastic way. So, we have to see that these sort of changes are the new phenomenon which are happening in the rural India, and the villages which we try to see in terms of the homogeneity, self-sufficiency, and then we try to see the distinctiveness, and also in terms of the smallness. I think these characters which has been marked by Robert Redfield has to be seen very differently, because villages are not seen as the has to be seen in terms of smallness now, in terms of distinctiveness, or in terms of homogeneity, or rather in terms of self-sufficiency. So, we have to see that what may be the new character, what may be the new possible characteristics which are to be seen with regard to the villages. So, that is how we have to see, and more important is that whether a specific understanding about the character of a village is going to be the representative character of the village across the nation is going to be an important question, and we have to address this particular issue, because ultimately we have to speak about that these sort of changes which we try to speak about. I think these changes are basically making the village to be more different, and to what extent the changes are being put differently in terms of the degree, that is going to be an important issue, because now we try to see that untouchability has not been ended, but it has declined. I think there is a famous work on the understanding of the changes with regard to the untouchability, which has been an edited volume, Untouchability in India by B.S. Bhaviskar, Satish Deshpande, and Nanni Sundar and other scholars, and they try to see that even in the 1990s we try to see that untouchability has not completely ended, but I think its form has changed, its character has changed, and sometimes the degree has changed. So, ultimately we have to see that we have to map the changes which the villages has to show, especially in terms of the degree. Like the Jajmani system, still we try to see the remnants of Jajmani system is found in many villages, but the important thing is that how we try to see that what are the new character or what is the new shape in which the Jajmani is being carried forward. So, ultimately we have to speak about these particular issues that will make our studies on villages more effective. And like friends, we try to see that different works which have been posed, either the Dumou's understanding about what the village is, or maybe B.S. Cohen's understanding about the village, or David Mandelbaum's understanding about the village, or for that sake scholars like M. S. Srinivas and S. C. Dubey. So, we have to see that through time what are the new new typologies of villages or the new characters of the villages which are coming. Sometimes many attempt has been made for the revisits to the villages which are been done by many various scholars. M. S. Srinivas himself has spoken about the remembered village and how the villages have been transformed through time. So, we have to see that the consistency with regard to the village studies has to be continued, because the focus here of course is that if we have to understand the rural society in a real sense, I think village is the starting point, and village as we know is not something which is a physical entity. It is very much social in nature in terms of its character, in terms of the prominence of caste, in terms of the diversity of population, and that way we have to see that villages are not to be seen as the constant entities, rather they are to be seen in terms of drastically vibrant, and also trying to come out with the new forms of protest, new forms of contestation, and that is what is the new character of the village. So, friends, village studies, if you try to see from the very starting that what are the various theoretical and the methodological issues which are involved with regard to the village studies in India, I think many issues have been taken up from synchrony to the diachrony, and also we try to see that multidimensional studies are to be taken we have to have the various parameters, new variables have to be introduced with regard to the village studies, and that is the way in which we can study the villages in totality. So, I think this is what we have to take from this discussion, and we have to understand the Indian villages in a new form, in a new framework, and I would suggest that it is not only the question of reading the material or trying to have the enrollment in the this particular course. Rather, what is more important of course is that you should apply these things, these theoretical framework, and apply it to your own setting, so that you can have a better understanding about whether the things which have been discussed are going at par with what you see, or sometimes if you have the new observations, I think the time has come where we have to actually document it, and we have to present the new rural, we have to present the new village which has to emerge in the real sense. So, I think this is what I had to discuss on the various component with regard to the village studies in India. So, that way I think the understanding of the rural society and the peasant within that framework, the village studies, that is unit 2, I think incorporates these important aspects which I try to cover up in this particular discussion. So, I think with these things I should thank, and I should be happy to have some of your sharp observations, and also maybe during the interaction during the setting we will try to see that what are the other ways in which we can make the things more clear. So, with that I will end it up here. Thank you once again to all of you.